Today, the conflict is not only unfolding on the territory of Ukraine, but also involves a battle of worldviews. It did not begin in February 2022, but 10 years ago, with the events of the Revolution of Dignity, when millions of Ukrainians took to the streets refusing to live in a corrupt satellite state of Russia. 10 years of the Revolution of Dignity. So today, on one side, there is Ukraine. We have Ukraine defending its democracy, freedom, rule of law, and human rights. On the other side, there is Russia, the authoritarian aggressor with imperial ambitions aiming to make neighboring states its satellite vassals. That Russia, where the authorities turned the elections into a performance with predetermined winners. That Russia, where the right to self-expression is brutally suppressed by law enforcement agencies. That Russia, where freedom of speech is suppressed. Orientation to Russia and so-called Russian world would mean the deepening of such practices. Instead, Ukrainians have always felt part of the European family and have protested against attempts to implement the described authoritarian practices. Ukraine cemented its course for European integration 10 years ago, during the Revolution of Dignity. Let's remember how it was. Autumn 2013. Ukraine was preparing to conclude the long-awaited historical association agreement with the European Union that was supposed to facilitate the transition to European standards across various spheres of life in the country. But on the eve of the signing, then President of Ukraine Viktor Yanukovych secretly meets with Vladimir Putin in Sochi. On November 21st, Yanukovych's government abruptly refused to sign the long-awaited agreement on deepened ties with the EU. In response to this, opinion leaders call on people to go out to protest. In just a few hours, around 1,500 people gathered on the main square of Kyiv, Maidan Nezalezhnosti, the Independence Square. The pro-Russian ruling elite attempted to suppress the protest. The district court of Kyiv banned the installation of tents, kiosks, canopies in the center of Kyiv. But the ban backfired. In the following days, protests erupted all over the country. In Kharkiv, Lviv, Luhansk, Vinnytsia, Donetsk, Kryvyi Rih, Sumy and Chernivtsi. Later, people from various regions began to converge on the capital. The protest endured for 3 winter months, with hundreds of thousands of people on the Maidan. Belgian Prime Minister Guy Verhofstadt dubbed Euromaidan as the largest pro-European demonstration in the history of the EU. Euromaidan endured continuously for 92 days. By comparison, in 1989, demonstrations for the overthrow of the communist regime in the Czech Republic and Slovakia lasted for 42 days. In Romania, the protest that led to the execution of the then dictator endured for 11 days. These events in Kyiv were closely monitored by the Kremlin. Mass civil protests against the decisions of the authorities were Moscow's real nightmare. So the campaign to discredit Ukrainian protesters begins in Russia. Vladimir Putin personally made several attempts to discredit the manifestation of the public will in Ukraine, referring to the Revolution of Dignity as another color revolution, claiming it was managed by the West. Events began to develop dramatically in February 2014, culminating in the tragic shooting of more than 100 protesters. But instead of suppressing the protest, this stirred it up even more. On the 22nd of February 2014, then President Yanukovych fled to Russia via Crimea. He has remained there to this day. In response, Russia decided to act aggressively. Over the next several weeks, Russia annexed Crimea and began the occupation of the Ukrainian Donbas region. The aggressor's goal was to create an open wound in the body of Ukraine in the form of a low-intensity war, aiming to hinder the country's progress towards development and European integration. Despite all attempts to prevent it, the Revolution of Dignity solidified Ukraine's commitment to integration into the European Union. Ukraine has systematically implemented European reforms over the past 10 years. The judicial reform has begun. The anti-corruption regulations have been significantly strengthened along with the creation of a system of anti-corruption bodies from scratch. There have been changes in the electoral legislation aimed at expanding the access of new politicians to the formation of new policies. The regulations of political parties' funding has been changed to minimize oligarchic influence on parliamentary decisions. The decentralization reform provided municipalities with more powers and budgets, brought the decision-making process closer to territorial communities. Since 2014, Ukraine has wholly reset the public procurement system by introducing Prozoro, an online platform that provides public public access to all tenders, empowering public watchdogs. Now Ukraine boasts an advanced e-government, with services that are unrivaled worldwide. Almost 19 million Ukrainians use the DIA app, which allows them to save all official documents on their own devices, from passports to enterprise registration documents, and even pay taxes and fines online, receive notifications about court cases and monitor the progress of services and applications. Ukraine reduced its dependence on Russian gas from 51% in 2013 to 0% in 2016. The Ukrainian army has undergone a significant transformation in line with NATO standards. All this time since 2014, the support of Ukrainian citizens for the EU accession course has remained stable, fluctuating from 50% at the end of 2013 to almost 70% immediately before the invasion by Russia on the 24th of February. Within a month after the invasion, this figure soared to an all-time high of 91%. Russia presents the world on the concept of rigid police state, laws that undermine human rights and democratic values, policies of suppressing minorities, restrictions of self-expression, and systematic suppression of freedom of speech. Life in the value system of the so-called Russian world is frankly frightening. That's why Ukrainians are prepared to curb its spread and fight for their right to the European development path, even on the battlefield, even in the conditions of the full-scale war. Since receiving the status of a candidate for EU membership in June 2022, less than a year and a half, Ukraine has made significant progress in fulfilling recommendations of the European Commission on strengthening the rule of law and fighting corruption. This progress has led the European Commission to recommend the EU member states' leaders to open accession negotiations with Ukraine, for the sake of a joint, peaceful and prosperous future for the entire European continent.